So when you get a new MacBook, how long does it take you to set that thing up? A day? 2? 3? More? I think the reality is for most of us that we avoid wiping our laptops or buying new laptops sometimes because it's such a pain in the arse to get them set up again. You know, you've got to remember all of the packages you installed from Homebrew. You've got to remember all the Mac App Store things that you downloaded that one time that you definitely needed for that one thing once every 6 months. And you know, there's just a ton of setup, like system preferences for like tap to click, like where do you want your dock? What kind of items do you want in your dock? I'm going to present today a solution that I found a lot of utility in personally called nix-darwin. This is based on top of Nix, the package manager. Of course, with Nix, there are multiple different things all called the same thing. So you've got Nix, the package manager, you've got nix-OS, the Linux distribution, and then you've got Nix language, the thing that you actually use to write the declarative configurations to configure aforementioned Nix package manager and nix-OS OS. The naming could use a bit of work, if I'm honest, but the core concept is pretty cool. So the idea is you declaratively declare, what a silly thing to say, your operating system or your view of the world. So you write a config file, and you know, in this case, we're going to use Flakes to configure this MacBook in front of me. I have a brand new 14-inch M4 Max MacBook Pro here. Well, it's not brand new. I've had it for 6 months, but it was getting a little slow, and I just thought, you know what, I'm going to wipe it and make a video about how I use nix-OS to configure my laptop. So here we are. But like most things in the world of Nix, at least, you will learn if you start going down this rabbit hole yourself, there are some foot guns available. There are some little gotchas. There are some things that you've got to pay attention to, like, should I use a flake? Should I not use a flake? And we'll cover a little bit of that in today's video. And the flake that I'm going to link to in the description is my own. It's been a labor of love for a good couple of years at this point, and I warn you, like, before you get into this, right, there are lots of other options available to configure your MacBook that are more approachable. Jeff Geerling's done some fantastic videos, for example, on how to configure macOS using Ansible. That's a perfectly valid approach. The downside of using something like Ansible, though, is it doesn't clean up after itself. The only way to know that Ansible is running in a clean slate is to do a completely fresh install every time. And unless you do that, you're kind of just guessing as the state of the world. Whereas with Nix, everything is declarative. The entire world view that gets built is a symlink tree that links to what's called the Nix store, which lives in /nix/store. Everything, every package, every configuration file, every binary, like literally everything is a symlink. Now, there are pros and cons to this approach, of course, but it does offer us some benefits in terms of isolation for packages. So one of the big selling points for a tool like Docker is the isolation of the dependencies of a specific package to that containerized environment. Well, you kind of get the same thing with Nix. So let's say you've got two packages that both need a different version of Python for whatever reason. Well, with Nix, they will symlink out to the version of Python that they need. So you could have 3.11 right next door to 3.12, and never the two shall meet because those two applications are linked with the symlink tree that Nix creates as part of what's called a Nix derivation. That derivation basically says to those programs, well, this is where you find Python, and this is where you find Python. So they both have their own individual views of the world based on the context that the derivation builds as part of the configuration that you apply. So I'm not going to sit here and try and espouse that Nix is a solution to all of life's problems. Homer Simpson told us many years ago, that's beer. But what I am going to do is sort of show you how I use Nix to configure my MacBook declaratively and set this thing up in, I don't know, I'm going to say less than 30 minutes from getting it out of the box. So I have a completely box fresh installation of macOS Sequoia 15.4 here. And my plan for this video is to just take you along for the ride and sort of show you how I go through setting it up. Then in a few weeks' time, I'm going to look through the comments of this video and try and pick out a few questions and just try and break down some of the idiosyncrasies that Nix has that you may well be struggling with and left a comment about, because there are plenty. And also, if I leave it a few weeks' time, it gives you time to try things out and kind of get stuck. And you know, in this age of LLMs, it's actually much easier to get started with Nix. I mean, the LLMs still get stuff wrong, of course, you know, they're not perfect, but you can also use things like GitHub code search to search for snippets of other people's configurations, and I'll link to some of my favorites in the comments down below. Martin Wimpress's config is fantastic. Mitchell Hashimoto has a good one. A good buddy of mine, Shane, I'll also link to his down there too. Of course, including my own, which is, I don't know, like it's my labor of love. And what's special about my Flake is it's mine. And there are many like it, but that one's mine. And I think the best and the worst thing about trying to adopt Nix is that there are 20 different ways to do everything. That's both a feature and a bug, in my opinion. And it's one of the reasons that you will hear the criticism levied against Nix fairly often that the documentation sucks. And that's because it's kind of self-documenting. After a certain point in your Nix journey, you kind of just start rolling with the punches and just kind of start figuring it out. Like, you know where to go and look. You know to go and look at search.nixos.org when you want to find a package or a configuration option, or you know that you need to go and look at Home Manager if you want to go and manage your dot files declaratively using the Home Manager modules. And I think it's one of those things that you have to know an awful lot about Nix and the way it works in order to write good documentation that is beginner friendly. But by the time you get there in your journey, you kind of don't need the documentation anymore. And so it takes a special kind of individual to bother to write that up, I think. And really, that's my take on why NixOS's documentation sucks. It doesn't really, because like I say, it's self-documenting. It's just one of those things that, because it's such a complicated thing to get into and the learning curve is so steep, that by the time you climb the mountain, you already know how to climb the mountain. So why waste a bunch of time? Like, hopefully you get my point. So let's dive into configuring this MacBook. Here we go, completely fresh installation of macOS Sequoia 15.4. Just to prove that to you, up here we go, Sequoia 15.4. There we are, that's now ready to go. So what do we need to do first? Well, we've got to install Nix. And to do that, I'm going to use the determinate Nix installer. And the reason I'm doing that is because they've put some good work into making it, I don't want to say more compatible, but they've kind of dealt with some of the idiosyncrasies of installing NixOS on macOS. And as you see here in this post from February 2023, they literally have macOS in the title. So now there is one gotcha. So I'm just going to open up my terminal here, copy that curl command to my terminal. There is one gotcha, and I actually had to retake this section because it bit me. And I think what I want to try and do here is show you warts and all. So like if there is a big mistake, I'm going to point it out or sort of show it to you on camera, because I don't want you to think that Nix is this panacea of perfection, because the reality is it's not. It's just one of those, it's like a hobby project. And I'll probably say that several times throughout this video of, don't go into this expecting to actually save time, because you're going to spend a long time writing your Nix configurations. Where you will save time and kind of feel that warm, fuzzy feeling is over the next few years, where you think, oh, I know what all of my Mac, like if you've got multiple Macs, like it's a no-brainer because you can run the same thing across 2 or 3 or 4 different Macs in the house and have this all be declarative and have custom dock layouts for different machines and all that kind of stuff. And we'll get onto that a little bit later. So right, let's undigress and actually install Nix on the Mac now, shall we? Okay. So I'm going to copy and paste this installer command into my terminal. And the very first question it's going to ask me is, do you want to install determinate Nix? And you might think the answer is yes, but actually the answer is no. So I'm going to answer no to this very first question. Determinate Nix is determinate systems kind of enterprise type Nix thing. I don't know too much about it, to be honest. All I know is that the version of Nix that we want to run today is the non-determinate Nix version of Nix. Next thing is going to now ask us to create a Nix store. So you remember I mentioned earlier the symlink trees and all that kind of stuff about where all of the binaries and their dependencies and their config files get stored. Well, in the macOS world, it's going to put that on a separate partition of /nix on your primary disk. So I'm going to answer yes. It's also going to create things like time machine exclusions for that directory, create build users, integrate directly into ZSH, which is the default shell for macOS. And that install process will take a minute, 2, 3 minutes or whatever. So I will be right back when that's done. Once installation is complete, which mine now is, you can either open a new shell or copy and paste this command into your terminal. I'm going to do this so it gives me the nix commands available to me. Next, I need to go and find a nix config or a nix flake or whatever it is, the configuration that you want to apply. Mine is open source on GitHub and is linked in the description down below. And I use this single flake to configure all of my Mac systems and also a couple of Linux systems in the house as well. Because Nix, the package manager, runs in many different places and speaks many different languages, you can actually use Nix to configure Darwin systems and Linux systems all from the same flake. This took me a long time to figure out, and I'm used to the Ansible world of having like a control box, in most cases that's usually my laptop, reach out over SSH to remote servers. And I took a long time trying to configure that with Nix remote builders and things, but because these Apple Silicon Macs don't have x86 chips in them like the servers that I run do, there was just a bunch of incompatibilities about trying to copy build closures all around the place, and it was a mess. By the way, there are chapters down below, so if you get bored of my tangents at any point, you can just skip along to the next part. But we'll come on to the layout of a flake probably in the next video in a bit more detail. But the short version is these inputs here are all of the external dependencies that my flake has. So you can see here I've got an external dependency on Nix packages, which is the upstream Nix kind of monolithic package repository. It's a GitHub repository. There's a bunch of stuff in here as well about nix-darwin specific packages. So you've got stable and unstable. You've got the nix-darwin modules. So Nix is basically importing all of these things. And when you create your flake Nix, your first time you run a build command, it will create a flake lock file. Now, if you're used to NPM or any other kind of package manager in the software development world, this will look very familiar to you. But essentially, this creates SHA-256 entries based on specific exact Git commits at that exact moment in history when you locked that file in place. And so what it means is that you can have these reproducible builds of all the packages and all the dependencies across the entire system from pretty much any moment in history, which is super nice. Now, you might have noticed up here that I've got this release of 24.11. Nix releases roughly every 6 months, so the next one will be 25.05. and 25.11 and so on. It's usually a month after Ubuntu, I think. You want to pay attention to that when you're revving up your Home Manager version. Now, Home Manager is a way of declaratively managing your dot files. So things like your tmux config, your neovim configuration, your git, when you do the git config email alias configuration stuff, you can declare all of that stuff declaratively with Home Manager, which we'll import later on in a module as part of our nix-darwin build. In here as well, there's a few lines, these 4 lines here, so 10, 11, 12, and 13. These are all what manage the Homebrew dependency. So when I want to manage things through Homebrew on my Mac declaratively, it has to import a bunch of modules that can understand how to do that. And that's what's happening in these lines here. Slopsnix we're not using today. That is something for encryption. And I'm using that on the Linux side of things to manage usernames and passwords to manage Samba shares declaratively. It's pretty cool, and I'll probably end up making a video about that later on. But the inputs are really just that simple. It's just, 25 lines, and those are all of the external dependencies that this flake has. Next, we move on to the outputs, and this is where we start building those derivations that I talked about. And for the most part, you're going to want to looking at lines like these. So this laptop here, I'm going to call it Navis, which is, if you're a Factorio player, you will know exactly what that means. But you have to make sure that the host name of your computer is set to match the host name that you're building the derivation for. So in my case, I need to go into the host name in System Preferences and type in Navis. And there we go. That's now set. My host name on this MacBook is now changed to Navis, and I could modify my configuration, but I know that's what I'm going to call this laptop in the long term anyway. So what is this doing? Navis equals libx.makeDarwin. mkDarwin. What does that mean? Well, you can see here that between these brackets, I'm passing in some arguments. In this case, the host name equals Navis. But what about things like my username? What about the system architecture? Don't worry, that's all taken care of with the helper library, which is actually declared a little bit further up here. So libx, which is what gets used here as a variable, if you're familiar with software development, this will make complete sense to you. But if you're not, you're probably looking at this going, I thought Nix was easy. No, this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? The learning curve is vertical. So you're going to have to learn some software development concepts to get started here. I'm afraid that's just the reality, and there is no way around it. So have fun. I mean, over the last year plus, I've had an absolute blast learning Nix. It's not easy, but that's kind of part of the fun. HomeLab has gotten to a point where it's kind of just a bit stable, a bit reliable, a bit, dare I say, boring. And we look for challenges by spinning things up on Kubernetes clusters at home when we all seriously know that a single x86 small form factor 1 litre PC will run all of our HomeLab services absolutely fine. And unless we want to get into this stuff to learn for work purposes or just have a hobby and have something to do at the weekends, HomeLabbing is kind of stable. So we go and look for the next challenge, and for me that was learning Nix. So let's go and try and find where libx is defined. This is our helper library that helps us build all of our Darwin configurations here. You can see here I'm importing from a directory of lib. So let's go and take a look in that directory. Over here on the left-hand side, you've got the lib directory, and this is defining a bunch of helper functions. So default is the first thing that gets loaded by the Nix, I want to say compiler, but the builder when you're running your Nix build commands. And literally all we're doing here is just saying import helpers.nix, which is this file here, and then inherit the functions that we define in that file of mkDarwin. mkDarwin is where all of the complicated stuff happens. So this used to live in the flake.nix file itself, but I found it really hampered readability of that file. So instead I moved it out to a different file, I think based on some stuff I saw in the flakes I mentioned earlier, linked in the description down below. And the reason I did this was because I wanted to add some logic around giving different machines custom dock layouts. Like my recording, well, actually this behind me is my work, my editing system. So I use this for all the Tailscale videos that I make. The dock that I have on that system is different than the dock that I want on this system from the dock that I want on my Tailscale recording laptop, demo laptop. And then I've got like a display Mac Mini, which actually runs on that second screen up there usually, showing the Blue Iris like camera feed from around the house. So when I'm up in the attic up here, I know what's going on outside. I don't need anything more than just like Google Chrome, maybe in a terminal on that second system. So why would I create a dock that's got the same stuff that's on my primary workstation? Well, using this logic here of custom conf path, so line 7 and 8. So unless a specific file exists under a path that matches the host name of a node that I want to build, I'm going to just use the default Darwin common doc file, which is declared under hosts, common, Darwin common doc. And so you can see here, these are all the persistent apps that will be declared in my macOS doc, unless I have declared them somewhere else under this Darwin folder here. You can see that Baldric, for example, has a custom doc file layout that looks like this. The Mac Mini that I referenced that runs up there, that has a custom doc layout that looks like this. So you can see how by using the if logic, we can define custom configurations and custom dock layouts for different machines and different purposes, all from a single flake. It's incredibly powerful once you start actually getting into that level of nitty-gritty detail, but it can also be overwhelming when you're new. I appreciate that. So remember I talked about the host name being something not to worry about? mkDarwin here takes a few arguments as inputs, and by default, the username is set to Alex. That's what the question mark means. It basically means if you don't see a username get passed into you as a variable when you get instantiated, use the username Alex. That's the default value. And the same goes for system here. It's arch-Darwin. Because we're building a Darwin derivation here, I think it's pretty safe to assume that these days it's an Apple Silicon Mac. I actually don't have any Intel Macs in the house. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in here that I could get into in excruciating detail. Things like common packages is probably a good one to look at in a second. Darwin common, again, that's just stuff that's common to all of the Macs throughout the house. Things like the Homebrew configuration happen here. Home Manager imports happen here. So Home Manager is probably worth a quick look. So under the Home folder here, I've got stuff like My NeoVim configuration, Starship configuration for my terminal is defined here. So I end up not needing a .file manager because it's all in Nix, and then it gets imported by Home Manager when it's building the derivation. And on top of that, a lot of programs support native options. So let's take a look at Fuzzy Finder. And actually, let's take a look at Git because I mentioned that earlier. You can see here that actually I'm able to configure the Git config parameters declaratively in my configuration right here, rather than having to write a config file or manually how many times have you Googled git config -- user.email equal, at least I think that's the syntax. I'm always just a little bit off that I try it, fail, go Google the thing and then come back again. Well, here it's declared until the end of time. I never have to worry about that ever again. As long as I'm using Home Manager and nix-darwin, this problem is now solved. And the best part, I can import this configuration into nix-OS as well. So I can have a standard home directory feel, fit and finish and feel and configuration across my Macs and my Linux systems as well. It's so nice. There's a bunch of other stuff in here. I mentioned Starship, and I'm going to point this out, that you can import specific configuration files if you have a particular penchant for declaring things in TOML as opposed to, maybe the nix-OS module for Starship doesn't expose the bells and whistles that you need, doesn't have the options that you need to actually create the thing. Well, you can import a TOML file in this method here. And so on this file goes. There's a bunch of stuff here like NeoVim's configured in a certain way. Zoxide is configured in a certain way. I've got my SSH configuration file in here too, right at the bottom here, programs.ssh. And you can find all of these options by looking on the appendix here for Home Manager configuration options. And I warn you, this page is a single monolithic page of just it must be tens of thousands of options. I mean, if I just search for programs.fzf for Fuzzy Finder, you can see here that just Fuzzy Finder alone has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You get the idea, right? And these are just Home Manager specific knobs and dials that you can tweak. If you want to tweak the knobs and dials in nix-OS specific stuff, you can go to search.nixos.org, go to nix-OS options and look for things. I don't know, do they have a Fuzzy Finder option? Yeah, of course they do. So sometimes you will find situations where options are available in both places, and it's up to you to really decide or figure out what makes the most sense, whether it's a system-wide parameter or whether it's a parameter that makes more sense to be basically in your dot files with Home Manager. So that's a quick overview really of the helper function, and let me just check there's nothing else in here that is super important. I mean, if you're going to take this Flake and try and use it, by all means, go ahead. Fork it, make all the changes you need to it. In fact, there's probably an awful lot of stuff that could be improved in this Flake. Should you be so kind as to submit a pull request, I will of course take a look at it and be happy to sort of talk through my understanding of certain things, because I'm fairly certain that I'm not a world expert in Nix, not even close. So there's probably somebody out there looking at something I'm doing here going, you idiot, why are you doing it that way? So please, if that's you, open a PR, leave a comment down below or something and just tell me I'm being an idiot, and I would genuinely love to improve my configuration based on your feedback. All right, it's probably about time to try and build this thing now. Let's clone the repo. We'll go to nix-config here and just get the URL for the repo onto our clipboard. And all I'm going to do is create a temporary directory with make_dir temp, enter into that directory. And then I quite often see, this is just a little tangent, I quite often see people typing clear at this point to clear their screen. You don't have to do that. You can just do Control-L and it does the same thing. I don't know if you knew that, but now you do. I remember when I learned that, it was like the first day I learned Control-R for reverse search, and I can now search for Nix, whatever. The terminal is full of a lot of cool stuff that maybe you know, maybe you don't, but I just love those little touches. All right, so I've got my Git repo here. This is not something I could make commit changes to because I'm just doing an HTTPS unauthenticated clone here. But what we're going to find is that I don't have Git installed yet. So I'm now going to have to wait for the command line tools to download and install, which, I mean, the last time I did this earlier today, it didn't take 5 hours, thankfully, but it did take a good sort of 5 minutes or so. So once it's done, I'll be right back. All right, it's done. Let's try our command again, shall we? All right, git clone. Okay, that now works. So I'm going to enter into my Nix configuration directory, and I'm going to cat out the just file that's in the root of that repo. Now, the just file is kind of like a bunch of recipes that get executed when you run certain commands. So we don't have just installed right now, so we're going to have to run these things manually on this very first invocation. But you can see here on macOS, at least, just all it would be doing is running this command here, nix experimental features, flakes, build, Darwin configuration. So I'm going to put that on my clipboard, and I'm going to delete the flags at the end because we don't need any of those. And then I'm going to use the target host name of this system, which is Navis. And now I'm going to press enter, and it's just going to work, isn't it? I'm pretty sure it's going to ask me at some point for Rosetta, because I have enable Rosetta configured in my Homebrew configuration. Now, even though the pitch at the beginning of this video was that nix-darwin is going to save you time, it's still got to build the derivation. So I think it's going to pull in like 6 or 7, maybe 8 gigabytes worth of dependencies from Nix packages and put it in the Nix store. And those packages, once they get put there, will then be symlinked under a directory called result. And I'll show you that in a moment when we need to run the switch command. Because when we are building derivations, we can switch between those different derivations at will, because we're building different generations of the system as we do this. And in NixOS land, you can boot between different versions of the OS from your grub or systemd boot menus. On macOS, of course, we don't have that option, but we can still switch between the different generations. So let's say we install a package and it breaks something beyond repair. We can just roll back to the previous generation, assuming we didn't garbage collect it first. We can just roll back to the previous generation and we're good to go. It's one of the things I really like about this. It's not a perfect safety net, but so far, for me over the last year or so, it's been pretty good. Now we are going to run into an issue with the Mac App Store installations here. I didn't actually walk you through showing you how we declaratively declare all of the dependencies for our Mac stuff. So let me jump into the host section whilst that's building and talk you through the Darwin stuff that's in common. So you'll see under common packages that I've got a bunch of stuff here. These are things like drill for DNS utilities, Dust, which is a modern version of DU. Got some of these things from Wimpy. Thank you, Martin. Figurine, this is an app that lets you print out a pretty little banner in your console. I actually maintain that packages for Nix. It's the only thing I've contributed to the Nix ecosystem, but you know, hey, you got to start somewhere, right? And all of these packages are common between all of my Nix compatible hosts. So all of my Macs will run this package set, and all of my Linux hosts running Nix will also run this same package set. You can also run Nix, by the way, the package manager, on top of things like Ubuntu, if you really want to, or Arch, or, you know, you don't have to run NixOS, but if you're running Linux, for me, at least some of the benefit is running NixOS on Linux. I mean, it does lack some of the safety valves, like some of the break glass stuff. Like sometimes you're like, I just want to run this one thing. I don't want to go and modify my configuration file. And yeah, it's simultaneously a brilliant system, but also incredibly constricting at the same time. So this is where the common packages live. That is a common package set across, like I say, Darwin hosts, macOS hosts, and Linux hosts. And then we have the Darwin common stuff. So these are things and parameters that only apply to macOS hosts and not Linux hosts, for example. Same as I've got NixOS common underneath. So I've done stuff like configure my Nix daemon here. I've set my home directory to a macOS specific path. I've got a few, what are these packages doing? They shouldn't be there. It's one of those things about looking at your own configuration. You'll always spot there's always something to do. You'll never be bored with NixOS in your life. So what else have we got in here? We've got fonts. I think it's important to put fonts at the system level rather than in like Home Manager or anything like that. So I think that's why fonts are here. And there's a bunch of stuff here to do with configuring Homebrew. And of course, yes, now we're at the point where I enable things like cleanup mode. So one of the benefits of managing your Homebrew packages this way is rather than having a bunch of old cruft that you don't know whether it's installed or been removed or whatever, if Homebrew sees a package was there last time but now isn't, it will clean it up and remove it if you have this zap option enabled. Super, super nice. You can enable brews, and I don't know why Bitwarden CLI is in here. Let me just check and see under packages. Is Bitwarden CLI? Yeah, I should probably move Bitwarden CLI out of brews and put it into my Nix like common packages list over here. But again, you will never be bored with nix-OS or Nix in your life. Casks are an interesting one because these are Homebrew specific things that allow you to install applications that have UI elements. So you can see here I've got everything ranging from Discord all the way through to Adobe Creative Cloud to, okay, there are some fonts here, which again, I'm not sure why the fonts are in there. Perhaps I should move those out of Casks, but stuff like Google Chrome is installed this way, MQTT Explorer. And it's just really nice that you think to yourself one day, right, I'm going to need this package probably for some point in the future. I'll shove it in my Nix configuration, and then it's always there on every laptop. Whenever you go to reach for it, it's always there, no matter whether you're on this one or that one or whatever. I mean, I appreciate not everybody has more than one MacBook in their life, but if you do, it's so sweet to do it this way. The next thing I want to show you is the Mac apps. And I mentioned that the Mac App Store thing has a bit of a bug at the moment. So macOS Sequoia 15.4 introduced a bug in the way that MAS, which is a command line utility you can use to interact with the Mac App Store, it introduced a bug with how that lists apps. So typically, the Mac App Store client CLI tool will provide a list of installed apps to Nix when it's running its build switch command. And so it doesn't try and install the same apps every single time. But right now that's broken. So this list of apps here gets reinstalled every single time. It's being worked on, it's been identified, it will be fixed, maybe even by the time you watch this video. But for right now, it tries to install all of these apps every single time. Bit of a pain. But you can get this unique number for each application, by the way, by going to the App Store and picking an application. So, I don't know, Final Cut Pro's right there. You click on the share button here, copy the link. And if I just put that text in here, you can see the number is 424.389.933. And sure enough, Final Cut Pro, 424.389.933. So that's how you get those specific numbers, and then you can manage all of your Mac App Store apps declaratively. So you've got your Homebrew stuff covered, you've got your Mac App Store things covered, and you've now also got your system preferences stuff covered too. Look, so I can set a whole bunch of system defaults, so things like tap to click, things like my screensaver timeout, guest enabled on the login screen, a bunch of Finder stuff. Like you, when you go to a fresh Mac, you realize just how many little tweaks you make over the years and months you have an installation active. Put that stuff in a configuration like this, and it will just always be present on every Mac until the end of time. So highly recommend doing this. And there's a bunch of other, things like dock configurations and Safari configurations and yada, yada, yada. We could literally be here all day looking at this stuff, but that's how you configure the Mac side of, the kind of declarative package management side of things for Darwin hosts. Okay, now this has been built, this derivation has been built. Remember I talked about the symlinks earlier? So under result, this is where everything just got built by the Nix, is it compiler or builder? I'm not sure what to call it. I'm going to call it builder because the command is literally nix build. This is what builds the derivation, the generation that we're going to switch to in just a second. And you see that lives a path under Nix store. So how do we now switch to that build? Because we've built it, but how do we actually now use it and actually install the applications and do all of that stuff that we've worked so hard to get to? Under macOS here, we have result, switch, flake, target host. And I'm going to show you a little trick right here. So a little shorthand you may or may not know is that on Nix hosts, if you do .hash, it actually references the specific flake for the host that you're using right now. Now I could put in here any host, so I could do Slartibartfast, which is my one of my other laptops, for example, and that would reference in my flake this line here. So that would build the configuration for Slartibartfast and apply it to this host. That's not what I want. I want to just do the local host of Narvis. So I'm going to do this, and it's now going to build the system configuration. It's going to ask me for my password, and I think this is where it's going to ask me to install Rosetta. Yes, here we go. This, thankfully, is a fast one, so I'm just going to copy and paste software update, install Rosetta, click type agree, and we're good to go. Okay, so now, result time. It's time to actually build and install the nix-darwin derivation that we built a minute ago. Except there's one more foot gun. macOS terminal doesn't have write permissions to the full disk. Why would you want a terminal that doesn't have permissions to write to your disk? Huh? It's just things like this drive me crazy about Apple. What are you doing? Breathe. Okay, so how do we fix this? We do full disk access. We need to look for this allow applications to access all user files. And just simply check the box here that says terminal, give your thumbprint or whatever, your touch ID thingy. And now we should be good to go, of course, because I closed the window, I ended the context, and I need to re-enter my sudo password. And you can see already that my dock has started to try to move to the left-hand side. There's a bunch of question marks right now because the applications that it's referencing aren't yet installed. Now this process will take 10, 20, 30 minutes, depending on your internet connection. It does take a long time. And occasionally you'll see like things just happened here where the download fails for no good reason. So you'll have to rerun this probably a couple of times just to get, there's a couple of race conditions. One of them is the items in the dock being applied to the positioning of the dock before the items underneath are installed. And occasionally, like I say, some of the downloads will fail. So I will cut this right here and be back probably in 15, 20 minutes when this has finished installing everything. I ended up resorting to watching a Jeff Porcaro video on how he came up with the Rosanna drum beat, one of my all-time favorite tunes, by the way, and all-time favorite drummers to boot. All right, so the Nix config is now built and applied. I ran it twice in the 2 seconds that you were waiting and the 30 odd minutes that I was waiting for that to run. But you can now see I've got all my applications installed. I've got everything present. And if I open up Ghosty now, which is my terminal of choice these days, you will see that I have all of my configurations now available, including my Starship configuration, including things like drill, including things like, well, what else was in my cask list and my packages list? It's all there. So if I now go to temp nix config, which is the directory that I temporarily cloned my Nix configuration into, you can see I've got all my Starship configuration for things like I'm on the main branch, I've got the time, I've got, you know, the directory that I'm in, I've got VS Code is here ready to go. Of course, it's a completely fresh installation of VS Code, so there's no theming or anything yet, but you know, you get the idea. I've taken my Mac in this video, it was probably a bit longer than 30 minutes, but in 30 minutes, I've taken my Mac from completely box fresh to having all of my tools installed, completely set up, apart from I've still got to log into everything, which is a whole other story. But the actual base applications are installed. A lot of the base configurations are applied. And that is really the magic of what's going on here with Nix. What's that XKCD cartoon where you're like, why spend a week automating something that you do that takes 30 minutes once every year or two? Well, I would argue that actually you manage packages on your Mac, or at least I do, quite often, and particularly when you've got multiple like I do here, having a way of being able to synchronize the package sets across your systems, both Mac and Linux, don't forget, for me is so super duper valuable. Yeah, I think what I want to do for today is just leave the video there, because there's probably a ton more I could get into, but I'm well aware it's, well, first of all, it's 11:30 at night here. I'm tired. And also this video is probably quite long enough already. Please, if you have Nix questions, I kind of want to just bring a few of you along for the ride with Nix and Nix configurations. And we'll dive into all sorts of configuration management on the channel. You know, I've recently been rebuilding my home lab and the hardware side of things. I think that's mostly done now. In fact, the 9950X box is just out of shot, just down there. Things are ticking over just nicely. I've got some Kubernetes content planned around Talos OS. So Ansible's going to be a big part of that, and Nix too. So I've got a bunch of pillars in my home lab. I've got Proxmox, Docker, Nix. I'm flirting with adding Kubernetes in there with, some 1 litre clustered PCs. In fact, you can see there's a pile of Dell 1 litre PCs just hiding behind the DeLorean over there. And if you have questions about Nix, please leave comments down below. I try to read all of them. I can't promise to have the answers to everything, of course, but I'll do my best. You can go over to self-hosted.show, where we talk about all this kind of thing way more often, and look in the podcast Discord at self-hosted.show/discord. There's a bunch of Nix nerds over there. Of course, Jupiter Broadcasting has a bunch of Nix nerds as well in their Matrix room. So lots of ways to get in touch with me and people who are Nix curious. If you've been wanting to dip your toes into the water of Nix for some time, come on in. The water's complex but lovely. That's what I should title this video, complex but lovely. All right, until next time, thank you so much for watching. I've been Alex from KTZ Systems.